introduce Dr. Rana Mitter from Oxford University, who is our distinguished speaker today in the lecture series on the Asia-Pacific War, speaking about the Chinese War of Resistance against Japan. And for the classes, I think is an important piece here to piece together the various angles that we've been taking. Let me very quickly introduce Dr. Mitter. He got his PhD at the University of Cambridge in the UK, and has been teaching at the University of Oxford since 2001, right? As its modern Chinese historian, it's history and politics, right? Modern Chinese history and politics. And is here now on a 3-week, almost 4-week spree, right?
Something like that.
He spoke at Harvard on Friday, and I heard his talk then, which he has graciously modified for us to sort of fit the various purposes here. And he's also speaking in South Carolina, and you had a New York engagement, so it's various things, Chicago, and the grand tour. So we are very pleased to have you.
Many thanks. Many thanks indeed to Professor Serafin for her very kind welcome, and I'm aware that this is the first event that you're having to sit through after spring break, so I hope you didn't leave too many of your fellows back on the beach in Florida. I'm willing to return for this. I'll try and make up for the lack of sunshine in terms of other elements of stimulation, I would hope. And what I'm going to do today is to talk about a really very big subject in quite a short amount of time. And that's the Chinese side of this amazing, wrenching, titanic series of events that, broadly speaking, we call the Asia-Pacific Wars of the 30s and 40s. I'm going to be talking about 3 major areas. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the war itself, mainly because I think it's fair to say that although many of the bits and pieces of that war are well known, the Second World War, more widely spoken of in China, is not nearly as well known in the West in terms of its events, its chronology, its significance, as either the war in Europe or, of course, the Pacific War, the American war against Japan, which, while related to the war in China, is in fact also a separate conflict. I know, of course, you'll hear quite a lot about that during this series as well. So just a few outlines I'm going to do in the first part. Secondly, because outlines are great, but they don't necessarily have as much meat as they have bones, you might say, I thought I'd take us through a bit of what it felt like to be at war during this time in China. And I'm giving you a little bit of the experience of war through the eyes of one person, someone who I suspect you may not have heard about, because I certainly hadn't heard of him until quite recently, a Chinese journalist who travelled around the front line of the war and wrote some really, I think, wonderful first-person accounts of what it felt like to be at the beginning of a very terrifying, seemingly unending conflict at that moment. And then the third, final part, I'm actually going to move ahead to the present day. I'm going to talk about why this war that happened nearly 60 years, or ended nearly 60 years ago, is still very relevant to understanding contemporary Chinese politics in the here and now, and in some ways I might say actually is even more relevant to understanding contemporary politics now, within the last 10 or 15 years, than it would have been 30 or 40 years ago. So it's a war that's almost become more significant in the present day than it was in the midterm past. But I realise that's quite a lot to get in, and Professor Serafin did tell me that I must on no account speak for anything longer than 3 hours, and that's okay with all of you guys? So, or perhaps nearer to 45 minutes. So we'll try and trot through those various issues. So let's just start with a few facts, figures, pictures as well, of quite what a major conflict this was. For some people, and you've been hearing about this in previous lectures, the Chinese war with Japan lasts all the way from 1931 to 1945. Some might argue it's never actually stopped, it's just been in abeyance and is perhaps starting up again. But in terms of the major conflict, that is something that is frequently heard. Having said that, 1937 really marks a major turning point in that conflict itself. In other words, it's the time when China and Japan moved from being in this kind of nervous state, half at war, half not at war, half at peace, to really all-out total war. One side or the other is going to win, and finally it's a war that involves the whole of both societies rather than just a simple part. The tension, which had been carrying on for years, finally broke out with first a very small scuffle between Chinese and Japanese soldiers in July 1937 near to Beijing. But this time, after attempted negotiations, both sides decided that it was impossible to back down. The Chinese demanded that the Japanese finally cease their demands for more territory in China, having taken, of course, Manchuria up in the northeast and much of northern China. The Japanese demanded that the Chinese stop, as they saw it, provoking them, and instead fit themselves into the Japanese New Order in East Asia. Clearly incompatible positions that one way or another had to be resolved. And in a very daring, as it turned out, rather miscalculated move, the Chinese leader of the time, Chiang Kai-shek, decided that the best way to try and fight back against the Japanese, at least in the first instance, was to launch a campaign where they were not expecting it, or where they were not concentrated. In other words, not near Peking in northern China, but at the center of China in the great port city of Shanghai. And as the conflict broke out, the conflict broke out in a much more widened sense of the war in those first few months, July, August 1937. One of the most notable images of the war was taken. I'm sorry I took this, as you can tell, from the front of someone's book, so apologies for the words. But this, if you haven't seen it, is a classic photo of the era taken by the photojournalist Randall Gould from the top of a hotel. And it's the Garden Bridge in Shanghai, which marks the division between what's on this side, which is the Chinese government control part of the city, and this part, which was called the International Settlement. In other words, it was actually a mini colony inside Shanghai, jointly run by British, American, and to some extent Japanese colonial authorities. And because when the war broke out, the Chinese side of the city was now at war, but the international settlement part was still neutral, thousands and thousands of Chinese refugees are fleeing across the bridge, making their way into safety in the international part of the city. And any of you who have been to Shanghai or have seen pictures of it will know that in fact the waterfront, the Bund, still looks very much like that today. The architecture is the same, which gives it a slightly eerie air, a very familiar scene with this really rather terrifying scene. The war progressed and blew up very rapidly. As I've said, the Chinese attempted to strike first, but found themselves quickly outnumbered and outdone in terms of technology by the Japanese. And while I don't intend to go through every single one of the campaigns that the Chinese fought, two of the major areas of conflict were up here in the north of China. Sorry, okay. Taiyuan, Peking itself up here, and so forth, where the Japanese already had a huge presence, of course, up here in the northeast, in Manchuria, and in Korea beyond that. And here at the center of China, Shanghai, you see there just above my finger, the city of Nanking, the Chinese capital at the time, all being attacked not only by troops coming down from the north, but amphibious forces coming from the sea as well. And during this whole time, the Chinese forces, fighting in many cases very bravely, but unable to stand up, retreating further and further west. First of all, the capital was moved from Nanking down here into the center at Wuhan, just above my finger there. And then finally, when even that fell, by the middle of 1938, they moved the Chinese capital way, way down here to the far southwest, the city which is here called Chongqing, but which nowadays is known by its more modernized title of Chongqing, up in the mountains, a very long way away from the Japanese armies, although still very vulnerable to air attack and air raids. There's only really one occasion, and we'll speak about it a little bit later, where the Chinese managed, at least temporarily, a major victory against the Japanese. And that's, actually, there's this thing here, you can see it says Tai Er Chuang, or Tai Er Zhuang, as pronounced in Chinese. That's actually wrong. It's, for some reason, the map, which is from quite a major book by Cambridge University Press, has it in the wrong place on the coast, and in fact it's nearer here to the city of Xuzhou. But this is one occasion where the Chinese nationalist government forces beat back a much larger Japanese army, only to find that they're unable to defend the town for very long and once again are driven back. Chinese popular culture quickly took the war on board, and one thing that's very notable at the time is the use, for instance, of newspaper cartoons. This is one of the perhaps rather cruder examples of what you get at the time. Japanese Soldier's Bestiality, a racially rather offensive cartoon of a Japanese soldier, but in the circumstances you could perhaps see why, and a literal and metaphorical cartoon involving the rape of China as a victim of this Japanese invasion. And this is a very common sort of imagery at the time. In some senses, I think far subtler, in some ways more impressive, is this cartoon by the well-known cartoonist at the time, Feng Zikai. It's, well, as it says on the left-hand side, it's a cartoon of bombs about to drop on a school for the blind and the mute. And I think one of the things that makes this image really very impressive is that it doesn't, as you might expect, crudely just show the explosion just after it happens. This is the last moment just before the bombs are about to drop, which gives it a real sense of poignancy, I think. And artists, writers, playwrights, filmmakers, all joined the patriotic bandwagon, you might say, and started to produce elements of popular culture. The war lasted a very long time. After the initial attacks, in fact, during most of the period from 1938 to 1945, China was effectively divided, broadly speaking, and very broadly speaking here, into three. Most of eastern China was under Japanese control. Most of southern and southwestern China was still controlled by the nationalist government, which had moved to Chongqing, and the northwest and center were pretty much controlled by the Communist Party. So during that period, all three sides, in effect, not necessarily fighting with each other as much as had happened in the first year, but waiting to see how the wider world war, of which they were now a part, in the Pacific and in Europe, would eventually settle down. And as I'll suggest a bit later on, although at the time the war itself seemed to be in some ways a victory for the Chinese, since eventually, of course, the Japanese did surrender in 1945 and the nationalist government was restored to its capital at Nanjing, the destruction that had been visited upon the Chinese state, the Chinese people, the Chinese sense of identity during that period was such that the nationalist government never really recovered, and this was one of the reasons why the communists eventually won their victory in 1949. This is a massive war. We don't have even now exact figures for how many Chinese were killed during it, but figures run from anywhere from about 15 million up to even 30 and beyond that, a truly staggering number of people. Individual events within the war itself saw numbers of dead which dwarf figures in other theatres of war. For instance, an action actually taking place on the orders of the nationalist government, not even the Japanese themselves, the blowing up of the dikes on the Yellow River to flood parts of central China and prevent the Japanese from coming forward, may have killed something like 800,000 people, simply as part of the defensive manoeuvres. And the archetypal figure of the period is the refugee. During this time, refugee flight in China is the one inevitable and massive social phenomenon that's noticed. And again, we don't have exact figures, but perhaps something like 80 million of the Chinese population may have fled and become refugees during this period. A massive social dislocation that explains a great deal about why the slowly developing state that was building itself up in the 20s and 30s was simply shattered by the events of war. So that's a very, very rough sketch of some of the events and some of the major facts and figures of the Sino-Japanese War, as it's known to the Chinese even today, the War of Resistance to Japan. What I'd like to go on to do now is to talk a little bit about some of the human cost and how the war itself was viewed at bird's eye level amongst individuals in China. And to do that, I'm going to introduce you to someone in whom I've become very interested recently and I think is not well known, but actually is a rather significant character. That's him, back row in the middle. His name was Du Zhongyuan. I'm sorry, I realised I don't actually have a handout, so any of you who want to put it down, that's spelled D-U for his surname. and his personal name is Zhongyuan, Du Zhongyuan. So who was he? Well, there was a time where if you were living in China, in one of the cities, in the mid-1930s, you wouldn't have had to ask that question, or almost certainly not. He was a very well-known public figure, a propagandist, journalist, and entertainer, you might almost say. He'd been born sometime before that, in 1898, in Jilin, in Manchuria, the far northeastern provinces of China. And he had grown up in an area in which the Japanese imperial presence was already very strong. He'd actually won a scholarship to study in Japan when he was in his teens and 20s. And when he was out there, he actually learned something very practical. He learned about what you might call ceramic technology, in other words, how to make bricks, porcelain, and so forth. And with the basis of this knowledge, he went back home to northeast China and set up as an entrepreneur. He eventually became a very prominent local businessman, but also a nationalist politician, and he organized a lot of political demonstrations against the Japanese imperial presence in Manchuria. This meant that when the Japanese occupied Manchuria after the invasion in 1931, he knew that he was in severe danger and basically had to flee pretty much overnight without being able to take much money or any of his possessions, and of course suddenly finding his previous high status and wealth were lost. But what he did already have was a secondary career as quite a well-known writer. Even before the invasion by Japan, he had started writing for one of the best-known news magazines based in Shanghai, although it was read actually in many of the cities of China. It was called Life magazine, not actually related to the American magazine of the same name, but in some ways not dissimilar. It covered recent news stories. It had lots of rather inspirational stories about how to kind of, do business and get rich. And it also had items including short fiction and pictures, news photographs from around the world. It was such a successful mix that actually this ended up as the single best-selling weekly news magazine in China up to that point, with something close to 1.5 to 2 million readers, which is a very large number of readers during that particular period. And because he already had a position as a columnist on this newspaper, once he got himself kicked out of his homeland, he used his column to try and bully, to try and persuade, to try and cajole the Chinese nationalist government into opposing the Japanese and taking back Manchuria, the occupied northeast of China. Now, he wasn't successful in that particular aim, because basically the nationalist government thought that it was simply not possible to take back Manchuria. The Japanese were too strong, the Chinese army was too weak. And to avoid a diplomatic incident, they kept trying to censor Du Zhongyuan, who ended up actually publishing from the international area of Shanghai that we mentioned, where Chinese censorship did not apply. Finally, though, he went too far, because he allowed a column insulting the Emperor of Japan to be published in 1935. And as a result, the Japanese basically threatened to invade Shanghai if he wasn't rounded up. So Du Zhongyuan finally got arrested. He was sentenced to 14 months in prison for having broken the censorship laws. But in fact, the government knew that he was so popular with his public that while they locked him up, they continued to allow him to have a certain amount of permission to write. And in fact, he actually managed to write a bestseller, which was called My Thoughts While in Prison. So he actually managed to sort of play both sides. He eventually, in 1937, though, got his moment, because despite Chiang Kai-shek's efforts, as we've said, war did break out between China and Japan. And once the war had started, there was no point in censoring anti-Japanese comment. In fact, rather the reverse was being encouraged by the government. So he could finally exercise his full nationalist tendencies and report on what was actually happening in the war against the Japanese. To finish the story of his life, very briefly, after finishing being a war reporter in 1938, he finally took an academic job actually in the far northwest of China, in Xinjiang, an area ruled by a local ruler who was in fact a sympathizer at the time with the Communist Party. And since Du Zhongyuan himself by then was fairly much inclined in that direction, he thought this would be rather a good job to have. Unfortunately, the local ruler changed his mind in the mid-1940s, arrested Du Zhongyuan rather suddenly, and after trying to have a sort of hostage swap with the Communist Party, ended up executing him in prison. So he actually died in 1944, a life cut short, but one into which he had packed a great deal of different life, career activities. Although he died and actually rather faded from public view, he has, in some senses, been revived in China in recent years because of his patriotic and nationalist activities during the war. But the thing to remember is that by the mid-1930s, he was one of the big brand-name journalists in China at the time. People read his column knowing who he was because of his very direct, very personal, and very distinctive prose style. He used to write a bit like, you know, a conversationalist, having a conversation written down on the page. He would include sort of swear words. He would talk about things that he'd seen that morning, reading the paper. It was a bit like having a conversation with a friend, and it was a very successful style that helped to sell a lot of newspapers. So, as he moves on to war, he continued this persona, this prose style, and this type of very personalized reporting when wandering around China trying to work out what was going on. One of the most appealing aspects of his wartime journalism is its very real immediacy. When Du Zhongyuan describes events during the war, they're very much given in detail, with a first-person narrative, I was there, I know what was happening, at the center of the whole enterprise. And of course, if you're reading it not as someone looking 60 years on at a whole bunch of reports, but as a newspaper reader, something coming out once a week or something along those lines with yet another report from the front line, it also added to the immediacy. It was almost like a story that you were waiting to hear the next episode of. But also, it's notable that the kind of writing that he did was in some ways very much, the naturalism of it, the realism of it, was actually very much constructed by learning from the technique that people like, for instance, traditional Chinese fiction writers and novelists had used. He knew that to sound realistic, you actually have to use a great deal of literary artifice. So it's actually a very clever type of writing, precisely because it seems so natural and so realistic and so just dashed off on the page. In fact, I suspect that he spent a great deal of time thinking about how he was going to write. What kind of things does he write about? Well, one theme that actually comes up over and over again is the theme of travel. And this is again not an accident, because actually for many, many centuries, but certainly in the early 20th century, travel writing has been a very central part of the kind of writing that Chinese do to entertain each other. Tourism, in a kind of modern sense, is actually quite a long-standing tradition in China, as it is, of course, in Japan as well, with people going on pilgrimages, ostensibly for religious purposes, but actually often because they want to see other parts of China, have a good time at festivals, and enjoy themselves as well as being religious. In the 20th century, leisure tourism, in the sense that we understand it, people simply traveling to far-off places for pleasure, became much more possible as you have things like mass transport. And for those many who still couldn't afford to do so, reading about travel was an important part of everyday entertainment. Now, the writing that Du Zhongyuan did about traveling around the war front, in a sense, is a variation of this kind of travel writing. And his readers would have known this, since they had obviously grown up alongside him and his writing. So one of the ways in which his writing about the war makes an impact is in the way it writes about both time and about distance, linked to both a literal and a metaphorical disorientation. After all, many of the phenomena that the war against Japan brought about, for instance, the refugee flows that I've mentioned, were very long-standing in China. Every time an alien dynasty invaded from the north, you would get huge numbers of refugees floating all over China. But the way in which it happened in the 20th century was wider and larger, and in some ways much more violent even than it had ever been before. And the way in which Du Zhongyuan talked about this in his journalism was also very innovative. So what's all this about time, then? Well, if you read his journalism about the war, one of the things that strikes you first is that you don't get that much mention, actually, of generals or battles or guns or whatever else it might be. Instead, there seems to be a strange obsession with late trains. One particular example, for instance, he writes in one of his columns to his readers, I took the train, and it ought to have got to... Actually, I'll give you the map as well, so you can see the places that he's talking about. There we go. Where's this one? Okay, so he's travelling around central China at this time, trying to report on what's going on. And he's around this sort of area. He says, our train ought to have got here to Xuzhou, just above my finger there, at 1 o'clock in the morning, and we should have then connected to the Lunghai train. But because of the delays, we didn't get there till 5 o'clock in the morning, and we had no choice but to get off the train and stay at the Huaiyuan Hotel. At 6:30 p.m, the train started moving west again. Although Suzhou used to be a tourist spot, everyone was now tearing around in a hurry and not looking properly at anything. Another example, on a journey to the northern city of Taiyuan, which, in case you have ever not been there, I do not recommend, since it's absolutely horrible. But it's in a sort of coal mining area of China called Shanxi, a major industrial centre and very important in terms of strategy. So he says, trying to get to Taiyuan, I talked with my friend Mr. Shao till 6 o'clock, then I got on a train to go west. When we got to Zhengzhou, which is just there in the centre, it's there as Chengchao, you can see, but pronounced Zhengzhou. It was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I changed the Pinghan train to go north. And when we got to Shijiazhuang, it was already 6 o'clock in the evening. Or else, on the way to another city, which is not actually marked there, but it's in the north, called Fengzhen. Fengzhen isn't more than a couple of 100 miles from Datong, and I would normally get there in an hour or two. But this time, because the stations had all been raided by enemy bombers, they were trying to repair them at the same time as running the trains. So I got on the train at Taiyuan at 10 o'clock at night, and we didn't actually arrive until 5 o'clock in the morning. Now, in the ordinary course of things, if you sit next to a train or a plane to someone who insists on telling you every single time's detail of how their journey was delayed, you generally find another seat. This is not the kind of thing that is the element of thrilling conversation. But there is a point to why Du Zhongyuan is doing this. Because, of course, the experience of disruption, of disorientation from total warfare, the type of modern warfare where actually you don't see soldiers turning up on the hill with swords. You don't see generals and battles and so forth. Instead, you're in a state of war, which you may never actually see the enemy at all for a very long time, if ever, is something new and very frightening for the Chinese people. And missed train times and delayed transport is one of the most notable and most prominent new forms of social phenomenon that concretely express why and how life has changed in a rather sinister sort of way. After all, don't forget, remember the context of this. Western timetabling of trains, and trains had only existed in China for a few decades before this. This is the 1930s we're talking about. You don't get a fully functioning railway network in China until really the very late 19th, early 20th century. So it was well within the lifetime of many people who wouldn't have been all that old, say in their 50s and 60s, to remember trains coming in the first place to China. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, the introduction on a wide scale of the Western clock. The elites in China, like the Emperor's court and so forth, had actually known about the Western clock for the best part of 250 years. But in the popular culture, until really the beginning of the 20th century, it was the lunar agrarian calendar still used. But one of the things, of course, it's very difficult to do with that calendar is run something like a modern railway timetable. So the Western style of time keeping had become much more spread. So no sooner had this type of introduced modernity been spread within China, within the space of really just a few decades, it was already being disrupted by this new, frightening form of total warfare. The late train is a repeated feature of wartime reporting, and as a means of creating this idea of how war was impacting on people's lives, it's a very powerful one. Because first of all, the train is indisputably a symbol of modernity in China. But also, and in fact, if you look at popular fiction at the time, there's a novel which is actually translated into English under the title Shanghai Express, which is well worth reading. It's a very, very funny and clever piece of writing. And it's by a popular writer at the time, Zhang Henshui, in which a series of characters, you know, a student, a shady lady, various sort of peasants and others, are all traveling on this train from Beijing to Shanghai and trying to do each other out of money and take part in various romantic encounters. But the fact that it was set on a train was meant to be a sort of rather innovative and exciting way of showing that it was right up to the minute. You know, it was really a kind of story about today. But at the same time, the train was one of the few aspects of modernity, technological modernity in China, that was also populist. I mean, lots of things like aeroplanes, which did exist at that time, were only the preserve of a very small elite. You had to be very rich to actually fly in China. And even roads, which you might think of as something that were more widespread, actually not that many of them had been built, you know, modern tarmac roads, asphalt roads in China. And those that there were often actually not much liked by the ordinary people, because many of the traditional forms of transport, things like donkey carts and so forth, don't actually work very well on tarmac roads because they hurt horses and donkeys' hooves. But the train was something that if you had a really very small amount of money, you could travel on for tremendous distances. And there are plenty of stories and reports at the time of peasants coming from the famine-stricken parts of inner China on a train to come and seek their fortune in Shanghai. So in that sense, talking about trains is Du Zhongyuan talking about something that will be meaningful to everyone at all levels of society. Another universal and very menacing experience that Du Zhongyuan talked about over and over again as a means of bringing about the feeling of wartime is a much more metaphorical one, and that's the weather. Now, those of you who've perhaps done First World War European history will know that in terms of literary production, mud is very much associated with the First World War at the Somme, the Marne, and the Western Front, partly because of the influence of the English and French war poets of that time. We now, even though it's in some sense a metaphorical association, associate bad weather and wetness and coldness and muddiness and so forth with the whole wider experience of the Great War. Bad weather is also something that Du Zhongyuan uses over and over again to try and bring some kind of sense of atmosphere to what it's like in the war. So, for instance, on that journey he took up to from Datong to Taiyuan, this journey here, way up here it says Tatung, that's pronounced Datong, and he's coming back down here to Taiyuan. But once again, one of his precious trains was late, so he in fact managed to hop a ride with a military truck. And it breaks down, so they eventually have to end up wading through the mud. And having got back in, they get delayed by fog, so once again, he finally gets into the city only at 1 o'clock in the morning. Or on another occasion, there's a flood. In October, he goes on somewhere and finds that the river has risen, submerges the bridge, and he has no choice but to turn around and get to the city another way. Now, in some senses, the fact that the weather is bad has got absolutely zero to do with the Japanese invasion. But as a means of trying to create that wider sense of disorientation, of panic, of discomfort and so forth, it's actually not only very powerful, but also something that most of his readers would clearly recognize very clearly. Something else very innovative that Du Zhongyuan writes about in great detail, and something clearly much more directly to do with the war, is air raids. This is not the first time that you actually get air raids in China. Amongst the first occasions when Chinese cities are bombed from the air are in the early 1930s, when Shanghai, for instance, is attacked briefly by the Japanese. But long-term bombardment by Japanese fighters is something new and obviously very terrifying to most of the Chinese population. This is actually new all over the world. I mean, one of the things that you may know again from European history is that one of the reasons European politicians in the democracies, France and Britain, was so terrified of war with Nazi Germany was that they thought that, actually not incorrectly, that the Nazis had very, very advanced fighter aircraft that would pretty much bomb cities like London, Paris, and so forth to rubble. And this concept of thinking in a new way about how you could be attacked, because of course in previous wars you might worry about people coming from the left, right, behind. Once they'd invented landmines, you could be attacked from below. But it was something new again, you have to look up as well and see the sky as a source of danger. And this is something that happens over and over again. During the period 1938 to 39, the nationalist capital at Chongqing was in fact the single most bombed city in the world. And considering that the Spanish Civil War was going on at the same time with plenty of bombing there as well, that's quite an achievement. The Japanese were not able to advance much further than this in terms of their troops, but they certainly could send fighters that far, dropping their bombs, as well as explosive bombs. They also dropped things such as bacteriological weapons, so a lot of people suddenly found themselves developing anthrax or other rather unpleasant flesh-eating diseases because of the bacteria that were being dropped over Chongqing. So clearly the air raid now became a very central part of the wartime experience. On his visit to and again, two of the things that you get as part of this are, first of all, a real feeling of claustrophobia, because of course, as in Europe, most of the air raid shelters in China when they were built were underground. And secondly, of course, sound became an important part of the experience of war. And again, this is something that's very parallel with what happens in Britain, for instance, during the Blitz at this time. The sound of air raid sirens over and over again, howling and forcing people to get underground, became a central part of wartime experience in China. So Du Chungyuan went up to Datong, up there in the north, which is a big sort of coal mining city, and wrote about this for his readers. Because the enemy aircraft come frequently every day on raids, the whole city had a very dead air. Apart from some long tunnels dug just alongside the city, the air raid preparations within the city itself were pretty much nil. Every day the officials in the city would grab a few bread rolls for breakfast and then run and hide in the tunnels from the aircraft until about 7 p.m. because they weren't able to bomb so effectively after dark, of course. And only then would they dare to come out and move freely. The enemy planes would come every day 3 or 4 times without stopping, and had actually bombed 180 people dead in the week that I was there. So, once again, a description, but also an atmosphere being created by Du Chungyuan in his writing. And throughout all of this, if you read quite a lot of his reporting, which is preserved, you'll find that he continues in this very conversational style to appeal to his readers. He uses a lot of casual language. He sets down conversations on the page almost as if they were spoken, lots of ums and ahs and what's his names and blah blah blahs and so forth. I mean, Chinese obviously, but nonetheless very much part of that kind of, as if I just heard it today and wrote it down without thinking about it. And also, as I've said, something he did before but really kind of pumped up during the writing, is lots and lots of swearing, which nowadays is not something you do politely very much in Chinese company, or indeed probably in American company. But in the 1930s, it's really a rather startling thing to put into a publication, and in some senses adds the sense of realism, because in real life, people do swear a lot, particularly when a Japanese bomber is arriving over their heads and dropping explosives all over them. People don't say dearie me and goodness and oh shucks. They say things that rhyme with some of those words, but rather more strongly. So Du Chungyuan puts all this down on the page, and as a means of continuing to keep that rapport with his readers, which has been building up over several years now through his newspaper, it's a very effective means. And yet, it's important to remember that the reason that Du Chungyuan did this is not because he's, kind of a reporter in the way that, someone from Time or Newsweek and so forth, all of whom were also there, of course. I mean, there are many foreign reporters in China during this time. But because he's a Chinese nationalist who wants to inspire the Chinese people to fight back against the Japanese. In that sense, it's political writing, in the same way that the communist writings of Mao Zedong, or indeed the nationalist writings of Chiang Kai-shek, the wartime leader, were also political writings. The difference being, and in some senses the reason I think that they're more powerful, certainly with the readers I think, is that they're written at the same level as the readership. I mean, however much Mao Zedong is concerned with the communist revolution, he's writing often rather complex ideological themes about, imperialism and the battle of class struggle and so forth, which frankly is not the kind of thing that, well, depends who you are, but personally it's not the kind of thing that I'd take for bedtime reading. Whereas you might easily find yourself buying the newspaper with Du Chungyuan's column. It's a hard day, the air raids have been out, you've been hiding down the shelter half the day, and finally you're crawling rather exhausted to bed, having put the children under some kind of protective layer or something, feeling absolutely exhausted. You have a quick look at the paper and read Du Chungyuan's column. It's comfort reading in that sense, and probably very effective in those terms too. But Du isn't just trying to comfort his readers, he's trying to remind them about why it's all happening. He creates this world of dysfunction and disorientation and makes it make sense for his readers. He relates their everyday experience to a wider narrative that accounts for this sudden, terrifying disruption in their lives. At the end of one rather sweet and homely anecdote, where basically they think these bombers are coming, and they're driving along, actually quite late at night in this sort of rural part of China, and suddenly someone thinks that these bombers are coming, and so everyone has to hop out of the car, and they're in the middle of a muddy field. So what happens is that everyone starts, crawling over this, muddy field to try and get to a village to stay for the night. And then all these women who are with them, they're actually wearing high heels, and they finally decide, well, I can't see any bombers, and actually I'd rather go and wait in the car and get bombed than have to walk in high heels across a muddy field. And maybe some of the women here will sympathise with this. So the Du Junyan rather ungallantly, I think, actually decides with his friends that they'll go on to the village and be safe, and if the women want to go and stay in the car overnight, then that's their business. He finally sort of ends up getting to the village, and then they find the only place that's open is the bathhouse, so they actually go in there, sort of eat a couple of eggs, and then are suddenly woken up in the morning by these rather astounded village bathers who wonder what all these nice city people in proper suits and things are doing, mysteriously appeared in their village bathhouse. So a nice kind of cute little anecdote there, but immediately followed in this story by the statement, well, and why has this happened? Why are we in this situation in the first place? Because of Japanese imperialism. This is something he then goes on to say that people still don't fully understand. They're so terrified that they don't understand the political reasons why the country has been invaded, and that once China becomes more politically conscious and willing to pull together as a nation, only then will they be able to fight back against the Japanese. So, Du Jungyuan had a very strong political agenda. It might be something that you would call, if you wanted to get a bit technical, a kind of rationalist Enlightenment modernity. He saw the war as an opportunity, in a sense. He says it's a terrible thing, but since the war has happened, let's use this to educate the mass of the population. He's talking about people who think that the air raid, people who've never heard of the Japanese, they think the air raids are caused by ghosts and spirits, and obviously have no nationalist consciousness at all. This is something he says they need to be educated out of. He also sees it as an opportunity to end the real corruption that there was in the Chinese government. People need to come together, he says, and actually create an honest bureaucracy that's going to really bring China forward. And his account of the new wartime capital at Chongqing is this actually very, perhaps rather over-optimistic one as to how it's left behind its feudal past, as he calls it, and is now a progressive city full of factories, energy, progress, where opium use has been abolished and everyone is working together. Now, from what we know from other sources about wartime Chongqing, this isn't really an entirely accurate picture of what's going on. There's a huge black market. People are kind of selling goods at incredibly inflated prices. There is plenty of opium going around for those who want it. But as an idea that he's bringing forward to his readers about why it's important to use the opportunity of the war, it says a lot about his agenda. If the war was unmaking China, in other words, then it could make it again as well. But to explain where that agenda went, I'll take us on to the last part, and then we move ourselves 60 years forward to the present day. And in some ways, the agenda that Du Jungyuan was putting forward, trying to use the reality around him of the wartime experience to define what modern China ought to be, is happening once again, except that now it's the memory and the legacy of that war that contemporary politicians and writers are using to try and understand what China is going to be at the beginning of the 21st century. What do I mean by that? Well, as I've said right at the beginning, this is a huge, massive conflict over a massive country. Millions of people dead, millions of people refugees, an entire government basically knocked off course and replaced by another much more radical, in this case communist, alternative. And yet something really rather odd happened to this massive war, the war of resistance to Japan, during the Cold War period. It disappeared. Nobody talked about it. In mainland China in particular, the war of resistance to Japan was really not something that was discussed by academics, by politicians, by students, by ordinary folks at all. Okay, that's not entirely true. The communist experience in particular in the northwest of China, where it says Shanxi up there, and particularly with their wartime capital in the city of Yan'an, which is just here. This is where Mao developed his communist revolution, and therefore the history of that particular small part, well not that small, but limited part of the war, was discussed in a great deal of detail. But everything else that was part of the story was pretty much off bounds. Nobody was allowed to talk about what the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek had done, because of course, immediately after the war with Japan, China plunged right into a civil war in which the communists fought the nationalists. The communists won, and therefore after 1949 and the communist victory, nobody was allowed to mention that the nationalists had ever done anything patriotic, anything to oppose the Japanese. And this myth grew up, in fact, that really Chiang Kai-shek's government had done practically nothing to fight the Japanese, and the communists had coordinated all of the resistance that there was, which simply wasn't the case. Even more dangerous was the fact that fully, pretty much a third of the country, and certainly the culturally most rich part of the Chinese heritage, places like Nanjing, Shanghai, Beijing, Canton, and so forth, were all under Japanese control. And there had been Chinese collaborating governments that had operated along with the Japanese invaders. These people, when they were mentioned at all, were simply called puppets, traitors, collaborators. We don't even talk about their history. What is there to talk about? These people are simply bad people who did a bad thing. And therefore, the wartime experience of millions of people who had to live under Japanese occupation, once again, was not really talked about. There were political imperatives in the Cold War as well that meant that it really wasn't possible to talk about the wartime experience in full. In particular, the fact that the enemy, Japan, was now obviously no longer an enemy. They'd been defeated by the Allies and were now disarmed under the Cold War agreements. But also both the Taiwan government, where Chiang Kai-shek and his nationalists had fled after 1949, and the mainland government were desperate to try and retain or gain the recognition of Japan as a major sort of trading partner. The Japanese didn't actually recognize the communist government until 1972, and the mainland was quite keen to get them to recognize them diplomatically. So they thought bringing up all the memory of the Japanese wartime atrocities and so forth simply wasn't a very tactful thing to do. So for most of the Cold War, the discussion of the war of resistance to Japan in China itself was very, very limited indeed. This changed significantly in the 1980s for all sorts of reasons. One of the main ones was that the classic Cold War was beginning to come to an end. Japan had already given diplomatic recognition to China. Both Mao and Chiang Kai-shek had both died, and there were new leaderships in all of the major governments concerned. And this means, at the same time, the Maoist experiment in economics had been, really pretty much discredited on the grounds that the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution, these two very traumatic internal upheavals, had really destroyed a great deal of the faith that there had been in the communist experiment. And the Communist Party, which was still very much in power and remains so to this day, had to seek something else that would help to create a sort of patriotic nationalist feeling amongst the Chinese themselves. So they began to think back, even before they had taken power, to that period when China had previously been inspired towards patriotic thoughts, and that was the period of the war against Japan. And one example of that, and one I won't talk about in any detail at all, but which you might know from other readings, is the revival of interest in the horrifying events known as the Rape of Nanking, or the Nanjing Massacre, in December to January 1937-38, when many tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, of Chinese civilians were murdered by the incoming Japanese Imperial Army, but which had never really been discussed in any detail in the mainland after the war because of the unwillingness to annoy the Japanese after that. And from the 1980s onwards, actually, interest in China in the Nanjing Massacre has been growing, and it's now a source of great political conflict between the Chinese and the Japanese today, because, talk about compensation, reparations, apologies, and so forth. But I'm going to briefly talk about something else that's less well known, I think, but also very interesting. And that is the way in which new writing within China itself, by generations, who are far too young to ever have been alive during the war, let alone remember it, have nonetheless been thinking about what the war's history means to them in terms of their identity as young Chinese today. And one particular example is a book called 我认识的鬼子兵, a book called The Devil Soldiers I Knew by a man called Fang Jun. This particular book was published in 1997. So who is this guy, Fang Jun? Well, he was born in 1954, so well after the war. He's not actually that young anymore, clearly, but nonetheless a post-war generation. He was born in Beijing. He became a steel factory worker and then joined the Communist Party itself in 1973. In the 80s, during the period of post-Mao liberalization, he studied Japanese at night school, and finally actually got a job for a Japanese newspaper in their Beijing office. He then went on in the early 90s to study in Japan itself. And there's some parallel there you might remember with Du Zhongyuan, who in the 1920s, in an earlier period of China's openness to the world, had taken advantage of education in Japan. Now, while he was there, Fang Jun remembered that actually his dad had been a Chinese army soldier, a communist army soldier, in the war against Japan. And he realized he'd never actually talked to any of the people on the other side, the Japanese soldiers. So he actually tracked some down and began to interview them. And of course, having had a background as a journalist, this was something that interested him as well. So the Devil Soldiers, the title, it's meant slightly, but not entirely ironically, are the Imperial Japanese Army veterans who had participated in the invasion of China in the 30s and were now, of course, in their 70s and 80s. The history that he wrote is not really, it's not an academic history. It's not really history at all. It's more of a memoir, a sort of a journey of self-discovery in a way that's actually quite familiar in the West, people kind of writing about themselves through discovering their pasts. So by going to visit these Japanese soldiers, talk about what their experience in China was like, and also rediscovering the Chinese wartime heroes, the book is about Fang's development of a patriotic nationalist feeling. He claims once again that he's just a simple guy, rather like Do Jungyuan. He's just a simple guy writing down, what he thinks. He's not really a writer, he's not a literary figure, he doesn't really know what he's doing. But again, like Do Jungyuan, this isn't really true. He's actually a very skilled writer who knows exactly what he's doing. And this can be seen in his intriguingly titled first chapter, which is called Human Flesh Dumplings, reporting that in one of his interviews with one of these Japanese soldiers, the old soldier told him some tales of how he had heard about someone else who knew someone during the war who said that Japanese guards at a certain prison in Beijing had taken Chinese prisoners, killed them, women in particular, and cooked up various of their body parts and eaten them. Now, although I can't go into huge historical detail there, I think that although the Japanese committed many wartime atrocities in China, eating flesh dumplings doesn't seem to be historically backed up. And if there was any occasion of eating sort of human bodies or something, it was probably battlefield extremities rather than being a deliberate policy of any sort. And it's a bit odd in a sense that he decides to bring up this particular rumoured second-hand story rather than the very real atrocities that we know about, such as the rape of Nanking. Why does he do that? Well, one of the major reasons is that in Chinese writing, for centuries, well before the 20th century, cannibalism has been a metaphor for the most inhuman type of behavior that you can possibly have. Those of you who read any modern Chinese literature in translation or in the original might know about Lu Xun's short story, Diary of a Madman, from 1918, in which the metaphor is used of someone who has realized that everyone around him is actually eating each other, behaving as cannibals. And this is a metaphor in the writer Lu Xun's eyes for Confucian traditional culture in China, which he believed was in fact cannibalistic and destructive, and that China had to instead cast it off and go into a much more modernized direction. Any educated person in China would have read Diary of a Madman. It's a very, kind of standard school reading type of thing, like, I don't know, what do people read here? Kill a Mockingbird or something? Something fairly standard anyway. And therefore, as a metaphor, talking about cannibalism is something that Fang Jun knows exactly what he's doing. It's not a randomly chosen image, particularly on chapter 1, page 1. Also, it speaks to other, more dark rumours of the recent past in China, such as the Cultural Revolution, where rumours again of cannibalism were spread around the countryside. In that case, it seems that there may occasionally have been some, although rarely, have been some truth to it. But again, as an image of what happens when behaviour goes out of control, this image of people eating each other is a very powerful one. And in this book, Fang Jun sort of writes about his thoughts, supposedly just kind of naturally on the page, but in fact, of course, a very literary type of writing in which he says, "As I was sitting with this old Japanese veteran eating dumplings, I suddenly felt as if the meat inside the dumplings was bright red human flesh. I put my plate down on the table and said to this old Japanese devil, 'This is human flesh. Old man, I can't make human dumplings out of human flesh for you.' And later, he visits Mount Fuji, the symbol of Japanese identity, or one of them anyway, and hurls accusations at the mountain. 'Why didn't you speak out?' he says to the mountain. 'Why didn't you tell the truth about this awful phenomenon?' Now, I don't know whether he literally got in the car and drove to Mount Fuji and did this. I have my doubts. But as a metaphor, it's clearly a very important symbolic moment to him. And this comes at the beginning of the book, and you go all the way through. He meets veteran Japanese soldiers, veteran Chinese soldiers. He actually comes to some sort of understanding. It's not a purely kind of xenophobic book. he sort of feels that the Japanese soldiers have apologized and that one has to take this into account. But his final feeling about what it all means is expressed in the very last part of the book, where he remembers, because he goes to Japan quite often, of course, he remembers when he was on the island of Hokkaido in the northern part of Japan, in the city of Sapporo, famous for its beer, of course, during a snowstorm. And the whole city is white, it's just covered with snow everywhere. And he's looking for the Chinese consulate. He wants to renew his passport, and he can't find it, and he's got lost in the snow. And he records his thoughts as being as follows. Well, where was the Chinese consulate? Wasn't there even a pathway? The cold of Hokkaido, the hunger, the isolation, all of these were pressing on my mind. But suddenly, in the middle of this pure white world, I saw our Chinese flag flying on a flagpole, the bright red 5-star flag of our country. The hot blood rose in my heart. I ran towards our national flag, my feet sinking into the snow. I wanted to cry. I wanted to laugh. Our motherland. I found you. Who says I'm just one person on my own in the snow? Isn't my great and strong motherland there together with me? Motherland, you've gone through so many trials. The Japanese invaders willfully trampled over your territory, willfully ravaged your people. But you, my motherland, you were not overcome. Amongst the forest of nations in the world, you're a giant. Motherland, I celebrate you. National flag, I salute you. Now, he doesn't say while he was sort of saying all this stuff whether he froze to death outside in the snow, but I was hoping he got inside the consulate before starting to express all of this. Fang is of the generation that came of age during China's disastrous Cultural Revolution. Remember, he joined the party in 1973. For those who joined the party at this time, the old certainties of Mao often have little resonance left, and for those who continued to believe, there was still a great deal of knocking at those old certainties. And this reviving of the history of the war came at just the right time. And it's also worth noting that the book was written in early 1997, a very patriotic moment, the return of Hong Kong to Chinese territory. In addition, and to conclude, you'll be glad to hear, no doubt, there was a much larger ideological investment by the state in trying to revive this memory of the war. It's not just a few isolated writers. And one of the ways in which this was most prominently done was through museums to educate the wider population. 3 big museums of wartime were set up between 1985 and 1987. One in Beijing, commemorating the whole of the war against Japan. One in the city of Shenyang, or Mukden as it used to be known in the northeast, commemorating the invasion of Manchuria. And one, of course, in Nanjing, talking about the Nanjing massacre, all of which were built on original sites where the war had taken place. Here's a picture of the very striking memorial museum to the invasion of Manchuria. I don't know if any of you can actually tell what this huge building, by the way, a person comes about a third of the way out the door, so this is a huge, great concrete building. I don't know if anyone can actually tell what this building is meant to represent. Anyone want to have a guess? Okay, well, I find it very hard to guess myself. It's actually an open desk calendar, so these are the sort of staples in the middle, the ring binders. Open at the date 18th September 1931, which is when the invasion happened. And these little kind of strange holes here are actually meant to be bullet holes. So the image you have to have is a Japanese soldier coming into an office and firing at the desk diary for reasons best known to himself. But again, this is something that you don't build this in your spare time. This involves a large amount of money and ideological commitment on the part of the Japanese government, Chinese government even. As does this. An example of what you would find if you went in to the Beijing Museum of the War of Resistance. And this is a very slightly dubious photograph because it was actually, I think, probably taken quite illegally and not really supposed to take photos inside the museum. But it's what you might call a diorama, a sort of 3D son et lumière reconstruction of this event I mentioned earlier, the Battle of Taiyuan. Now you can tell it's a very stylized reconstruction because for those of you who read Chinese, you can see the name Taiyuan is there, but strangely enough, in real life, battlefields don't actually have the name of the battle neatly placed in front of them. But on the hour, when the motor is switched on, you suddenly get kind of screaming, shouting, puffs of smoke, rattling of machine guns and so forth, as the battle is reenacted for the mostly audiences of school children and others who were brought to the museum itself. And we actually have statistics from the museum, and it gets a very significant number of people. By the turn of the century, so the late 90s, early 2000s, it was getting pretty much close to about 1 million visitors a year, which is a lot, even though they're primarily brought in, of course, as organised educational coach parties. And all of these museums are used as very openly and explicitly as what they call museums of patriotic education. In other words, they're designed specifically to remind the Chinese youth, but also the wider population, of China's history of resistance to Japan as a means of inculcating patriotism in the Chinese population of today. And in some senses, China is being portrayed by its own, by those who create its own history, both as victim and as hero at the same time. And that's something that I think is not by any means unique in China. This is something that you get in almost all societies at the moment, outside what you might call the dominant world order of North America and Europe. Russia, India, particularly under the previous government, which was an extreme nationalist government, radical Islamic societies as well. The narrative of what you might call dispossession, being given a raw deal in the new post-Cold War order, has become very powerful in a world in which certain parts of that order are seen as dominant. The Chinese past informs the present, not just the Sino-Japanese War, that's important, but also the Opium Wars and other aspects of the seeming humiliation of China by foreign powers. And public opinion is clearly responding. When opinion poll surveys are done, I'm sad to say that there is in fact much more xenophobic feeling against Japan expressed in the last 10 to 15 years than seemed to be the case even before that, because official permission seems to have been granted through much of this propaganda to once again talk about the Japanese as enemies. In other words, China is using its war of resistance to Japan to fight back, not just against the past, but also against its present. And in that sense, the kind of writing that Du Zhongyuan did in the 1930s, and the kind of writing that Fang Jun is doing, and the kind of work that the museums are doing, are all part of a long-standing, continuing narrative, rather than one being a historical and one being a purely present political enterprise. I'll leave it there, I think, pretty
We have some time, and thank you for getting through this without water, which is still in my office.
Oh, right, thank you.
And I wanted to say just two things quickly while you all work out your questions, right? All the things that I should have said in the beginning and didn't. In many ways, this was an absolutely wonderful talk that ties together things for us as a class quite nicely. But for me as a listener and who knows your work, at least in part, it also made things come together for me in terms of Dr. Mitter's first book, The Manchurian Myth, which came out in 2000. He really established himself as a scholar of Manchuria, and very much, I think one would call it an intellectual history. It really has to do with nationalism and questions of nationalism and competing nationalisms in Manchuria and identity. And then this beautiful book that just came out in the fall, right? In the summer, in 2004, A Bitter Revolution, which takes the May 4th movement as its starting point and actually takes the narrative through the 20th century. And it's also in many ways about constructions of nationalism, which really work very nicely together with this lens that you use today of Du Zhongyuan. And then, of course, makes the connection with the contemporary writers and the construction of a nationalist, not just ideology, but narrative, and how to communicate this to a larger public. So I wanted you to know about these two books. They're both wonderful books and very well worth reading. And of course, we've all read your article on the museum. And with that, I'd like to throw open the floor. We don't have tremendously much time, but I do hope that you have a few questions lined up that you now have a chance to ask. Andrew?
Doctor, first of all, said that the infrastructure in China at the beginning of the invasion was very primitive, with ox carts and not even paved roads. also wondering, during the invasion, what was how significant was the American mercenary involvement, like the Flying Tigers, Clash and all?
Okay, that's two very good questions and separate ones. For those who may not be able to hear, I'll just repeat them perhaps before answering. The first question was about the infrastructure in China in terms of roads, trains, and that sort of thing, and you know, how advanced it was or not at that sort of time compared with today. I think one shouldn't either over or underestimate the progress that had been made by the time the war broke out. One of the things that hasn't been fully appreciated until recently about the nationalist government, and in fact I think your own Professor Nadostov is someone who knows a great deal more about this than I do, so you should quiz her at some point soon, is that in fact the nationalist government of Chiang Kai-shek, while in many ways very corrupt and very dubious and very unable to control aspects of what was happening in China, still made very genuine and real efforts in terms of building modern infrastructure in China. And the war with Japan and its sudden its relatively sudden outbreak really threw that modernizing project off course. One of the what-ifs of history might well be what would have happened if they'd, say, had another 10 years of peace to develop the economy at that time. Nonetheless, the number of modern tarmac roads or trains and so forth was still relatively very limited. Today, and particularly in the last 15 years or so, as the economic growth of China has really been expanding, there has been at the same time also a real expansion in the amount of infrastructure that's built. Not least since the Chinese government explicitly these days says that by the year, say about 2020, 25, it wants China to be a predominantly urbanized, if not necessarily urban, society, which does not mean that they want everyone to move to Shanghai. In fact, they definitely don't want everyone to move to Shanghai because it's already too big, they think, but rather that living in small to medium-sized towns and moving people away from the countryside as a primary source of livelihood is their short-term aim. One of the reasons that the wider population in China didn't necessarily want to do this is that through all the political troubles there have been over the century, having your own bit of land on which to grow food is by no means a bad safety net. In terms of the American contribution to the war against the Japanese, I think it may be a bit pejorative possibly to regard the Flying Tigers as mercenaries. These are, we should explain, a group known officially as the AVG, the American Volunteer Group. They weren't exactly volunteers, although they weren't conscripted either. They were a group of flyers led by General Claire Lee Chennault, who were effectively authorized by the Roosevelt administration to, quote marks, resign from the American Air Force and join the Chinese Air Force, but were paid for by US dollars. The reason being that Roosevelt didn't want to officially be involved in conflict against the Japanese before Pearl Harbor actually happened, of course, but he did want to make sure that the Chinese government did not fall. And in fact, most historians, I think now, for a long time, the contribution of the American presence in China had been rather downplayed in Chinese histories of the period, because of course America was not a friend of communist China. But in recent years that's really been reversed, and there's a great deal of historical attention in China itself to the contribution made by the Flying Tigers specifically, and by American troops more widely in the defense of China against the war. The flip side of that, and one which I think Western historians would agree with, is that there is, I think, a strong suggestion that both the British and the American troops in the wider China, Burma, India theatre were generally quite willing to put Chiang Kai-shek's needs second because they wanted to defend the road, particularly the British Empire, to India. And this often meant that Chinese troops were diverted from defending the Chinese heartland to instead protecting the Burmese border. And this is something that the Chinese themselves were not very keen on, but it was in the Western propaganda, it often came out as being that the Chinese were unwilling to fight, which wasn't the case at all.
Was another question over that way? Yeah.
Was there any evidence that the writer also was being paid in some official way for propaganda value?
Actually, he probably wasn't being paid in the sense of official propaganda at all, because he belonged to a publishing enterprise with which the nationalist government had had a very long-standing and unfriendly relationship. Basically, the enterprise in which he was working, which was called the Shenghua Life Publishing Company, was one of the few actually commercially successful, well not few, but one of the most commercially successful publishing enterprises in China through the 20s and into the 30s. and they actually had a branch network of publishing houses, of bookshops and so forth, all across wartime China. They were well able to actually support their writers on their own. But I think had he been given a choice, Chiang Kai-shek himself would not have been particularly enthusiastic about pushing money Do Junyan's way.
I was wondering if you might update the article of yours that we read. You spoke about China, the Chinese government's use of sort of rehabilitating the nationalist role in the war as a way of bridging the gap with Taiwan. I was wondering if you might give us an update into how that's going with China, the fourth generation of leaders taking over in China, and
Absolutely.
that sort of thing.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, that's definitely, I mean, the reunification with Taiwan and therefore trying to rehabilitate the nationalist experience of the war is definitely one of the Chinese government's agendas. And in fact, this year, there'll be yet another phase of that museum open. Of course, it's the 60th anniversary of the end of the war, and this has given them a kind of peg on which to hang yet another gallery being opened, which I'm not quite sure what's going to be in it, but it should be interesting. However, there's a very fundamental misconception, I think, in the Chinese efforts, which are quite genuine, to make this agenda happen. Because the way in which they've been trying to bring the Taiwanese back on board is by praising Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists. The problem is that Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists have not actually been very popular in Taiwan for a very long time. I mean, the opposition have actually been, you know, the parliamentary opposition in Taiwan have both held the presidency and also a significant number of the seats in parliament for quite a number of years. And even for those members of the Nationalist Party who came to Taiwan, the agenda of that party is completely different from what it was on the mainland in the 1930s and 1940s. So in other words, the Chinese were sort of trying with some sincerity to try and rehabilitate what would have been a very popular agenda in about 1976, but in 2001, 2005, it simply doesn't have any kind of popular resonance, I think, in Taiwan itself, which doesn't bode very well, I'm afraid, for cross-straits relationships.
One more question? From anyone?
Yeah. Back.
Actually, why don't we have you, since you already got to ask one?
Okay.
You said in the last 10 to 15 years that China has used the war of resistance against Japan to reorient the people's view on their relationship with Japan, like
Yeah.
China's relationship with Japan. Like, does it do that with, like, is it going back into its history now and trying to reorient people? Like, is it trying to affect people's views of past events towards current actors in, like, the international system or in general? Like, how does China define itself in relation to other nations based on its history? Like, is doing that?
Right. So you mean in all sorts of aspects, not just about the war?
Yeah, like, are there other historical instances that China has used in the last 10 to 15 years to reorient itself?
Yeah. Broadly speaking, yes, the answer is yes. I mean, actually, even more than in many other societies, although in some ways, in similar ways to other societies, Chinese governments and the current Chinese government are very keen on using aspects of the past to serve current political needs. And this can be a very, very long way past. For instance, Confucianism, which clearly wasn't a very popular doctrine during the days of, you know, pure Marxist communism, has now actually been rehabilitated because it's felt to be a source of nationalism and patriotism, and studying the kind of ancient ways of China and so forth is now quite actively encouraged as a patriotic activity. Aspects also of relatively less recent history, such as the 19th century and the attempts of the late imperial governments before the fall of the emperors to try and fight back against foreign invasion, are another historical metaphor which you use quite a lot. There's a guy called Zheng Guofan, who you may have read about if you've done a 19th century China course, who was in the late 19th century one of the figures who tried to work out indigenous ways in which China could fight back against foreign imperialism after the Opium Wars. And there's been something of a boom in, you know, studies and discussions of Zheng Guofanism as a patriotic sort of discourse. But at the same time, I mean, China has at least two, if not more, concurrent needs. One is to try and assert its place in the international society, but also it does have a genuine and strong desire to be seen as a responsible power in international society. In other words, China isn't about, I don't think it's about to sort of take over the world. It wants to be seen as someone who must be consulted in whatever's happening in the wider society. And in the last year, it's amazing the number of Chinese missions there have been to South America, to the Middle East, to parts of the world where the Chinese would not have thought, I think, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, of having a presence. But on the other hand, their aim there is simply to peace. Well, simply, their aim is, stated aim, is to make peace, to help to negotiate, to try to be seen as an actor who has something to offer in the international society. And this exists at the same time as this discussion about bringing back memory of the past.
I think that's actually a great place to stop. You wrapped it up very nicely. Thank you very much.